The radio crackled to life at 3:47 a.m., cutting through the silence of Juliet Carter's taxi like a knife. She'd been parked outside Murphy's diner, waiting for the occasional late-night fare that might stumble out looking for a ride home. 3 years of driving cab in Millbrook had taught her the rhythm of the small town. Quiet most nights, predictable always. All units, all units. We have a major incident at the old Sterling mine. Multiple casualties. Emergency services are requesting all available transportation to assist with evacuation. Juliet's hands tightened on the steering wheel. The voice on the radio belonged to Martha Chen, the night dispatcher who'd become something of a friend over the years. Martha's usual calm had cracked, revealing the panic underneath. Other drivers began responding immediately. Unit 7, en route. Unit 12, heading there now. Unit 3, 5 minutes out.
Juliet stared at the radio microphone hanging from its cord. Her mouth felt dry. She knew she should respond, should grab her keys and race toward whatever disaster had struck the old mine. That's what taxi drivers did. They helped when help was needed. But Juliet Carter wasn't just a taxi driver. She used to be someone else entirely. 3 years, 4 months, and 16 days ago, she'd been paramedic Juliet Carter, Emergency Medical Services, Metro General Hospital. She'd been the one people called when everything went wrong. She'd saved lives, delivered babies in the backs of ambulances, pulled people from twisted metal and burning buildings, until the day she couldn't save the one life that mattered most. Unit 23, please respond. Juliet, we need every driver we can get. Martha's voice brought her back to the present. Juliet picked up the microphone, her thumb hovering over the talk button. Unit 23, responding. The words came out as barely more than a whisper, but Martha heard them. Thank you, Juliet. Head to the mine access road. They're setting up a triage area at the main gate. Triage. The word hit Juliet like a physical blow. She hadn't heard that term spoken aloud in 3 years. In her new life, she dealt with grocery runs, airport pickups, and the occasional drunk who needed to get home safely. Clean, simple, safe. Nothing like the chaos that awaited her at Sterling Mine. As she drove through the empty streets of Millbrook, Juliet's mind wandered back to the day that changed everything. It had been a Tuesday. She remembered that clearly. The call had come in as a simple vehicle accident on the interstate. 2 cars, minor injuries, routine response. But nothing about that day had been routine. The second car had contained a family returning from vacation. A mother, father, and their 7-year-old daughter, Emma. The little girl had been wearing a pink princess dress and clutching a stuffed elephant she'd won at some seaside carnival. When Juliet arrived on scene, Emma was unconscious but breathing, pulse weak but present. Classic signs of internal trauma, probably a ruptured spleen. Textbook case. Get her stabilized, get her to the hospital, let the surgeons work their magic. Everything had gone according to protocol. Juliet had done everything right. IV established, vitals monitored, continuous communication with the emergency room. Emma had even regained consciousness during transport, asked for her mommy, squeezed Juliet's hand when told everything would be okay. The hospital was only 8 minutes away. 8 minutes. Emma died in Juliet's arms 6 minutes into that journey. The autopsy later showed an undiagnosed heart defect that no one could have detected. A rare condition called hypertrophic cardiomyopathy that turned what should have been a survivable accident into an impossible situation. The cardiologist explained it to Juliet 3 times, using increasingly simple language, trying to make her understand that nothing she could have done would have changed the outcome. The condition affected 1 in 500 people, Dr. Martinez had explained. Most lived normal lives without ever knowing they had it. But sometimes, under conditions of extreme stress or trauma, the thickened heart muscle could cause fatal arrhythmias. Emma's accident hadn't killed her directly. Her heart had simply stopped working properly under the stress of her injuries. The Medical Review Board had been thorough in their investigation. They'd examined every aspect of Juliet's response, from her initial assessment to her treatment decisions to her communication with the receiving hospital. Their conclusion had been unambiguous. Juliet had performed flawlessly. Her care had been textbook perfect, her judgment sound, her execution exemplary. Paramedic Carter's actions were consistent with the highest standards of emergency medical care, the board's report had stated. No alternative course of treatment would have changed the patient's outcome. This case represents an unavoidable tragedy, not a failure of medical intervention. But Juliet couldn't hear the explanations. All she could hear was Emma asking for her mommy. All she could feel was that little hand going limp in hers. The rational part of her mind understood that she'd done everything correctly, but her heart couldn't accept that sometimes doing everything right still wasn't enough.
She'd requested a leave of absence the next day, extended it after 2 weeks, made it permanent after a month, then she'd disappeared. The transition to Millbrook hadn't been easy. For weeks after arriving in the small mountain town, Juliet had wandered its streets like a ghost, unsure of who she was without her uniform and her purpose. She'd rented a small apartment above Henderson's hardware store, paying cash and avoiding questions about her past. The nightmares had been the worst part of those early days. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Emma's face, felt that small hand growing cold in hers. She'd tried therapy, tried medication, tried every coping mechanism the Employee Assistance Program had recommended. Nothing helped. The only thing that provided any relief was distance. Physical distance from the hospital, the ambulances, the constant reminders of her failure. Millbrook had offered that distance. Tucked away in a valley between 2 mountain ranges, the town felt like it existed outside the normal flow of time. People moved slower here, talked quieter, lived simpler lives. It was the perfect place for someone who wanted to disappear. The town itself had been founded in 1932 by miners seeking copper deposits in the surrounding mountains. For 46 years, the Sterling mine had been the economic heart of the community, employing generations of families and supporting a network of businesses that served the mining operation. When the mine closed in 1978, many people had expected Millbrook to become another ghost town, joining dozens of abandoned mining communities scattered throughout the western mountains. But the town had adapted, transforming itself into a quiet haven for retirees, artists, and people seeking escape from the pressures of modern life. The adaptation hadn't been without its challenges. Unemployment had spiked when the mine closed, forcing many families to relocate in search of work. Local businesses had struggled as the economic base disappeared. For nearly a decade, Millbrook had teetered on the edge of becoming another abandoned mountain settlement. But community leaders had worked tirelessly to attract new residents and businesses. They'd promoted the area's natural beauty and peaceful atmosphere, drawing retirees from urban areas who were seeking a quieter lifestyle. Artists and writers had discovered the town's charm, establishing small galleries and craft shops. A few small manufacturing companies had moved operations to Millbrook, taking advantage of lower costs and a skilled workforce. By the time Juliet arrived, Millbrook had stabilized at around 3,000 residents. It wasn't prosperous, but it was sustainable. The kind of place where people knew their neighbors, where local businesses survived on community loyalty rather than tourist dollars, where life moved at a pace that allowed for reflection and healing. The idea to drive taxi had come from pure necessity. Her savings were running low, and Millbrook didn't offer many employment opportunities for someone trying to disappear. Martha Chen had been running the dispatch service for 15 years and needed reliable drivers. She hadn't asked many questions when Juliet applied, just verified that she had a clean driving record and could pass a basic background check. The work suited Juliet's desire for anonymity. Most fares were simple: Elderly residents going to medical appointments, teenagers needing rides to school when they missed the bus, occasional tourists who'd wandered into Millbrook by mistake. The conversations were minimal, the interactions brief. Perfect for someone who no longer trusted herself to make life or death decisions. But even in her new life, Juliet couldn't completely escape her training. She found herself automatically checking the vitals of elderly passengers who seemed short of breath, suggesting that young mothers with crying babies consider checking for ear infections, noticing the signs of domestic abuse in a woman who regularly called for rides to the clinic with suspicious injuries. She never acted on these observations, never offered medical advice or asked probing questions. She'd learned the hard way that her instincts couldn't always be trusted, that her training had limits, that sometimes even the best intentions led to tragedy. So she drove and she watched, and she kept her knowledge locked away where it couldn't hurt anyone. Now, as the glow of emergency lights appeared ahead of her on the mine access road, Juliet wondered if disappearing had been the right choice after all. The scene at Sterling Mine was controlled chaos. Emergency vehicles lined the access road like scattered toys. Ambulances, fire trucks, police cars, and a growing collection of civilian vehicles that had responded to the call for help. Portable floodlights had been set up around the mine entrance, creating harsh circles of white light that made everything outside their reach seem darker by comparison. Juliet parked her taxi behind a line of other cabs and walked toward the command post that had been established near the mine's main gate. She could see Martha Chen coordinating with other drivers, assigning pickup points and destinations. The dispatcher looked harried but competent, her clipboard filled with scratched notes and updates. The Sterling Mine had been abandoned for over 40 years, a relic from Millbrook's brief flirtation with copper mining in the 1960s. The town had grown up around the mining operation, then slowly adapted when the ore played out and the company moved on. Most residents had forgotten the mine existed, hidden as it was behind a screen of second-growth forest and posted with weathered "no trespassing" signs. The mine itself was a testament to an earlier era of industrial ambition. During its operational years, it had employed over 300 people and produced copper ore that was shipped by rail to smelters in distant cities. The main shaft extended nearly 1,000 feet into the mountain, with dozens of side passages and chambers that had been carved out to follow ore veins through the rock. When the copper reserves were exhausted in 1978, Millbrook Mining Company had sealed the main entrances and walked away, leaving behind a complex network of tunnels that remained largely intact. Over the decades, weather and time had taken their toll on the wooden support structures, but the mine's basic infrastructure had survived remarkably well. The company had done the minimum required by law when abandoning the site. Main entrances had been sealed with concrete barriers, warning signs had been posted, and a basic security fence had been erected around the most obvious access points. But the mine's extensive tunnel system had dozens of smaller openings scattered throughout the mountainside, many of which remained accessible to determined explorers. But urban explorers had discovered it in recent years, drawn by online forums that shared locations of abandoned industrial sites. Despite the posted warnings and occasional patrols by local law enforcement, groups of young people regularly made the trek up the mountain to explore the tunnels with flashlights and cameras. The collapse had happened around midnight, according to the first responders. A group of 12 college students from the state university had been deep in the main tunnel system when decades of weathering finally took their toll on the wooden support structures. The tunnel hadn't fully collapsed. If it had, there would have been no survivors. But several massive beams had fallen, blocking the main exit and trapping the explorers in a maze of interconnected passages. "Juliet!" Martha called out when she spotted her. "Thank God you're here. We need someone to take Mrs. Henderson and her son to Millbrook General. She's walking wounded, but the boy has a broken arm and possible concussion." Juliet nodded, though she found herself looking past Martha toward the mine entrance. What happened here? Old support timber gave way around midnight, brought down part of the main tunnel. There were 12 people inside, some kind of urban exploration group. You know how kids are these days. We've gotten 6 out so far, but... Martha's voice trailed off as a stretcher emerged from the mine entrance. The person on it wasn't moving. How many medical personnel on scene? Juliet asked automatically. 2 paramedics from county, 1 doctor who lives in town. Fire department has some EMT training, but... Martha shrugged helplessly. It's not enough. Never is out here. Millbrook's isolation was both its charm and its curse. Nestled in a valley between 2 mountain ranges, the town was a 3-hour drive from the nearest major medical center. The volunteer fire department did their best, but they were farmers and shopkeepers and retirees who'd learned basic first aid to help their neighbors. For serious emergencies, the county sent paramedics from the regional EMS station. But that was a 45-minute drive on winding mountain roads. The closest trauma center was even farther away, nearly 4 hours by ambulance through mountain passes that could be treacherous even in good weather. Most serious cases had to be evacuated by helicopter, but that required suitable landing zones and weather conditions that weren't always available. It was the kind of medical isolation that made every emergency potentially life-threatening, every minute of response time critically important. The regional emergency medical system was stretched thin across hundreds of square miles of rural territory. County paramedics covered an area roughly the size of Rhode Island, with only 4 ambulances and 8 full-time staff members. During busy periods or when multiple emergencies occurred simultaneously, response times could stretch to over an hour. Juliet watched as the paramedics loaded the unconscious victim into an ambulance. Even from a distance, she could see they were overwhelmed. Their movements were efficient but hurried, the kind of pace that meant too many patients and not enough time. She recognized the signs because she'd lived them for 8 years. That feeling of being pulled in 12 directions at once, of having to make split-second decisions about who to treat first, of knowing that every choice could mean the difference between life and death. In the city, backup was always available. Multiple ambulances, hospital networks, specialized teams for every kind of emergency. But out here, resources were limited and help was far away. The county paramedics would have to handle multiple critical patients with minimal support, making decisions that would normally be shared among entire medical teams. Mrs. Henderson is over there, Martha continued, pointing toward a woman sitting on the bumper of a pickup truck. She had a bandage around her forehead and was holding a boy of maybe 10 years old. She's stable, but we need to get the kid looked at properly. Juliet nodded again and started walking toward her passengers. But she'd only taken a few steps when shouting erupted from the mine entrance. "We need medical down here, now!" One of the firefighters came running out, his face grim. "We found 2 more, but they're trapped under a beam. One's unconscious, bleeding from the head. The other's awake, but can't feel his legs." The county paramedics were already busy with other patients. The local doctor was inside the mine working on someone else. For a moment, no one moved. The silence stretched for several heartbeats, filled with the distant sounds of rescue equipment and worried voices. Juliet could see the calculation happening in everyone's minds. Not enough medical personnel, too many patients, critical decisions about who could be saved and who might have to wait. Then Juliet heard herself saying, "I'll go." Martha turned to stare at her. "Juliet, you're not certified for—" "I used to be a paramedic," Juliet said quietly. "Before I moved here. Metro General Hospital, 8 years of service." The words felt strange in her mouth, like speaking a foreign language she'd once been fluent in. Martha's eyes widened. In 3 years of working together, dispatching calls and sharing coffee during quiet shifts, this was the first time Juliet had mentioned any medical background. Why didn't you ever? Because I had my reasons. Juliet was already walking toward the mine entrance. Do you have any medical supplies I can take down? One of the firefighters overheard and jogged over. Captain James Rodriguez had been with the Millbrook Volunteer Fire Department for 23 years, since he was 19 years old and fresh out of high school. He'd seen his share of emergencies in the mountains, hiking accidents, hunting mishaps, the occasional house fire or vehicle wreck, but nothing like this. The mine rescue was the kind of operation that small-town volunteer departments trained for, but hoped they'd never face. Complex, confined space rescue, multiple casualties, unstable structural conditions. It required specialized equipment they didn't have and expertise they'd only read about in training manuals. Rodriguez had been coordinating with county emergency management, but resources were stretched thin across the region. A chemical spill on the interstate had tied up 2 search and rescue teams, and severe weather in the eastern part of the county had grounded the medical helicopter. The helicopter issue was particularly frustrating. Mountain weather could change rapidly, and tonight's conditions included low clouds and gusty winds that made flight operations impossible. Even if they'd been able to get a medical helicopter airborne, suitable landing zones near the mine were limited. "We've got a trauma kit in the truck," he said, studying Juliet with curious eyes. "But ma'am, are you sure about this? It's dangerous down there, and if you're not current on your certifications—" Juliet looked at him steadily. "How long has it been since the collapse?" "About 4 hours." "Then we don't have time to debate certifications." She followed Rodriguez to his truck and accepted the medical kit he handed her. It was heavier than she remembered, but her hands knew its contents without looking. Pressure bandages, IV supplies, cervical collar, emergency medications. Everything she'd sworn she'd never touch again. The weight of the medical kit in her hands brought back a flood of memories. 8 years of riding in ambulances, running into situations that most people ran away from. The adrenaline rush of arriving on scene, the systematic assessment of injuries, the careful dance of keeping someone alive long enough to reach definitive care. She'd been good at it. Not just competent, but truly skilled. Her supervisors had recommended her for advanced training, suggested she consider becoming a flight paramedic or pursuing additional education to become a physician's assistant. She'd had a reputation for staying calm under pressure, for making the right call in complex situations. Her specialty had been pediatric emergency medicine. She'd completed additional training in child-specific protocols, learned to work with families in crisis, developed techniques for communicating with frightened children during medical procedures. It was challenging work. Children's physiology was different from adults. Their responses to trauma were often unpredictable, and their emotional needs required as much attention as their medical ones. But it was also deeply rewarding. There was something magical about reassuring a scared child, about using just the right words to help them feel safe during a medical emergency. Juliet had kept a collection of small toys and stickers in her medical kit, tools for turning medical procedures into games that distracted young patients from their fear and pain. Until Emma. "Ma'am?" Rodriguez was watching her with concern. "You okay?" Juliet blinked, realizing she'd been staring at the medical kit for several seconds. "Yes. Sorry. It's been a while." As she approached the mine entrance, one of the rescue workers handed her a hard hat and safety vest. The worker was Tom Bradley, a retired coal miner who'd moved to Millbrook 5 years earlier when his lungs couldn't take the dust anymore. He'd volunteered for the rescue operation because he knew mines better than anyone else in town. Bradley had spent 37 years working underground in coal mines across Kentucky and West Virginia. He understood the sounds that old timber made when it was under stress, could read the signs that indicated when a tunnel was becoming unstable. His experience made him invaluable for this rescue, but it also made him acutely aware of how dangerous the situation was. The Sterling mine was built differently from the coal mines Bradley knew best, but the basic principles were the same. Wooden support structures held up thousands of tons of rock, and when those supports failed, people died. He'd seen too many cave-ins, too many funerals, too many families destroyed by the sudden collapse of what should have been safe passages. Follow the blue guideline, he instructed. It'll take you straight to the collapse site. But if you hear any creaking or shifting sounds, you get out immediately. Understood? Juliet nodded and stepped into the darkness. The mine tunnel was narrower than she'd expected, barely wide enough for two people to walk side by side. The blue guideline was actually a thin rope stretched along the wall, illuminated at intervals by battery-powered LED lights that cast eerie shadows on the rough-hewn walls. The air smelled of dust and dampness, with an underlying metallic scent that Juliet recognized but tried not to think about. Her footsteps echoed strangely in the confined space, seeming to bounce back from multiple directions at once. She'd never been inside a mine before, but something about the environment felt familiar. The sense of urgency, the controlled movement through a dangerous space, the weight of responsibility pressing down on her shoulders. It reminded her of responding to structural collapses in the city, apartment buildings weakened by gas explosions, construction sites where accidents had trapped workers under tons of concrete and steel. The tunnel sloped downward at a gentle angle, and Juliet could feel the temperature dropping as she moved deeper underground. The LED lights created pools of visibility in the darkness, but between them were stretches where shadows swallowed everything beyond arm's reach. The geology of the mine was visible in the walls around her. Layers of different rock formations told the story of geological processes that had occurred over millions of years. Veins of copper ore, the reason the mine had been built, were still visible as greenish streaks running through the darker stone. The mining operation had followed these ore veins wherever they led, creating a complex network of passages that branched and reconnected throughout the mountain. Some tunnels were wide enough for equipment and ore cars, while others were narrow exploration shafts barely large enough for a single person. After what felt like forever, but was probably only 5 minutes, she reached the collapse site. The scene was worse than she'd imagined. A massive support beam, probably weighing several tons, had fallen diagonally across the tunnel. It was held up at one end by debris and at the other by what looked like pure luck. Underneath it, she could see two figures.
The beam was old-growth timber, easily 3 feet in diameter, the kind of massive wooden support that had been common in mines built during the 1960s. It had probably been supporting the tunnel ceiling for over 40 years before age, and moisture finally caused it to fail. Now it rested at a precarious angle, creating a dangerous pocket of space underneath where the victims were trapped. The engineering challenge was obvious even to someone without structural expertise. The beam was balanced on unstable debris, held in place by friction and gravity. Any significant vibration or movement could cause it to shift, potentially crushing anyone underneath or triggering a larger collapse. "Hello?" she called out. "I'm here to help. Can you hear me?" A weak voice answered from the shadows. "Here. We're here. Please hurry." Juliet crawled forward carefully, testing each piece of debris before putting her weight on it. The space under the beam was cramped, maybe 3 feet high at most. She had to lie on her stomach to reach the victims. The first person she encountered was a young woman, maybe 25, conscious but obviously in shock. Blood matted her blonde hair, and her left leg was bent at an unnatural angle. "What's your name?" Juliet asked, automatically slipping into her old bedside manner. Sarah Mills. Is Ben okay? He's not talking anymore." Juliet looked toward the second victim, a young man lying motionless about 6 feet away. Even in the dim light, she could see he was in bad shape. "I'm going to take care of both of you," Juliet promised, "but I need you to stay calm and answer some questions for me, okay?" She began her assessment of Sarah, checking pupil response, pulse, breathing. Classic signs of concussion, but stable. The leg was definitely broken, but it wasn't a compound fracture. Painful, but not immediately life-threatening. Sarah was a graduate student at the State University, studying geology. She'd joined the urban exploration group 6 months earlier, drawn by her academic interest in abandoned industrial sites. This was her 3rd trip to the Sterling mine, and she'd been excited to photograph some unusual mineral formations she'd spotted on previous visits. The group had entered the mine around 9 p.m., planning to spend several hours exploring the tunnel system. They'd brought proper safety equipment, hard hats, flashlights, rope, emergency supplies. They'd even filed a rough itinerary with friends who weren't part of the exploration, establishing a check-in time for the following morning. Everything had been going perfectly until the support beam failed. Sarah had been documenting mineral formations with her camera when the beam fell. She'd heard a loud crack, looked up to see tons of timber falling toward her, and thrown herself sideways into a small depression in the tunnel wall. The movement had probably saved her life, but her leg had been caught under falling debris. "Can you move your toes for me, Sarah?" Sarah wiggled her toes on both feet. "Good. No spinal damage." "Okay, I'm going to give you something for the pain and then check on Ben." "You're going to be fine. But I need you to stay awake for me." "Can you do that?" Sarah nodded weakly. "Who are you? Are you with the rescue team?" "I'm Juliet. I used to be a paramedic." The words came easier this time. "I'm going to take good care of you." Juliet prepared a mild pain reliever from the trauma kit and administered it via injection. Her hands moved with muscle memory, each action as natural as breathing, despite the 3-year gap. The medication would help with Sarah's discomfort without compromising her consciousness or respiratory function. In a confined space like this, with limited ability to monitor patients continuously, it was important to use medications conservatively. Then she crawled over to Ben. The young man was unconscious, his breathing shallow and irregular. When Juliet checked his pulse, it was weak and thready. She gently palpated his head and found a significant depression in his skull just above the left ear. Severe head trauma. Possible intracranial bleeding. He needed emergency surgery, and he needed it now. Ben was Sarah's boyfriend. She learned from whispered conversation with Sarah while she worked. He was 26, a computer programmer who did urban exploration as a hobby. He'd been the one leading their group deeper into the mine system when the collapse occurred, following a tunnel that promised access to the lower levels.
They'd been together for 2 years, having met in a photography class at the university. Ben's interest in abandoned places had been purely aesthetic at first. He loved the way light and shadow played through broken windows and doorways, the way nature slowly reclaimed human-made structures. But the hobby had evolved into something more serious. Ben had become fascinated by the history of these places, the stories of the people who'd worked and lived in them. He'd started researching the Sterling mine months ago, learning about its operational history, studying maps of the tunnel system, planning the safest routes for exploration. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. Ben's careful research and planning had led them to this specific section of tunnel because he'd identified it as one of the most structurally sound areas of the mine. The support beams here were larger and in better condition than those in other sections. It should have been the safest place to explore. But time and moisture had weakened even the strongest timber supports. The beam that fell had probably been under increasing stress for months. developing microscopic cracks that gradually widened until the structure could no longer support the weight above it. But first, she had to make sure he survived the trip to the surface. Working by feel in the cramped space, Juliet established an IV line and began pushing fluids to combat shock. She fitted Ben with a cervical collar and used pieces of debris to create a makeshift backboard. The work was challenging in the confined space, but Juliet found herself falling back into old patterns of thought and movement. Her training had included scenarios like this: confined space rescues, structural collapses, situations where standard procedures had to be adapted to impossible circumstances. The key was to stabilize Ben's condition enough to survive extraction, while being careful not to exacerbate his injuries. Head trauma patients were particularly vulnerable to secondary damage from movement or changes in blood pressure. "How are they?" came a voice from behind her. Juliet turned to see one of the rescue workers, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and calloused hands. The woman stable. Broken leg, concussion, but she'll recover. The man... Juliet paused. "He has severe head trauma. We need to get him out of here immediately, but it has to be done carefully. Any jostling could make the injury worse." The rescue worker was Jackson Briggs, a construction contractor who'd volunteered for the operation. He'd spent 30 years building houses and commercial structures, and he understood the physics of structural failure better than most. The sight of the fallen beam made him nervous. It was balanced on debris that could shift at any moment, bringing the entire section of tunnel down on top of them. Briggs had worked on several building collapses over the years, including a warehouse collapse that had trapped 5 workers under tons of concrete. He'd learned to read the signs of structural instability, to understand when rescue efforts had to be balanced against the risk of further collapse. The Sterling mine situation was particularly challenging because the collapsed beam was still partially supporting the tunnel ceiling above it. Removing the beam to free the trapped victims could trigger a larger collapse that would kill everyone in the area. "We've got a basket stretcher topside. Give us 10 minutes to rig a pulley system." "We don't have 10 minutes, Juliet said quietly. "His intracranial pressure is building. If we don't relieve it soon..." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. "What do you recommend?" Juliet looked around the cramped space, calculating angles and clearances. "Can you get me a drilling kit? Something with a small bit, very precise?" Briggs's eyes widened. "You're not thinking of doing what I think you're thinking of doing." "Not down here. Burr holes to relieve pressure, it's a standard procedure. In a hospital, maybe. Not in a collapsed mine tunnel." Juliet met his gaze steadily. "It's that or watch him die. Your choice." She'd assisted with emergency burr hole procedures 3 times during her career. Twice in the emergency room when neurosurgeons weren't immediately available. Once in the back of an ambulance when a patient was deteriorating too rapidly to wait for hospital arrival. It wasn't a procedure paramedics typically performed, but in extreme circumstances, when a patient's life hung in the balance and no other medical personnel were available, the protocols allowed for it. The procedure itself was relatively straightforward. Drill small holes in the skull to relieve pressure from bleeding or swelling inside the brain. But it required precise knowledge of skull anatomy and carried significant risks if performed incorrectly. In Ben's case, the risks of not performing the procedure clearly outweighed the risks of attempting it. His neurological signs were deteriorating rapidly, indicating that pressure inside his skull was reaching dangerous levels. Briggs was quiet for a long moment. Then he keyed his radio. "Topside. This is Jackson. I need a medical drilling kit down here ASAP, and see if Doc Morrison can talk us through a procedure." While they waited for the equipment, Juliet continued monitoring both patients. Sarah was holding steady, though her pain was increasing as the shock wore off. Ben's condition was deteriorating rapidly. You really know what you're doing? Sarah asked weakly. I used to, Juliet replied honestly. Dr. Morrison was actually Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, a retired family physician who'd moved to Millbrook 7 years earlier after practicing medicine in Chicago for 35 years. She'd thought her emergency medicine days were behind her when she retired to the peaceful mountain town, but situations like this reminded her that medical training was never really obsolete. Morrison had never performed burr hole surgery herself, but she'd assisted with the procedure during her residency training and had studied it extensively in medical school. She understood the anatomy involved and the critical importance of precise placement. Morrison had retired to Millbrook specifically to escape the pressures of urban medical practice. After 3 decades of treating gunshot wounds, drug overdoses, and the countless tragedies that filled emergency rooms in major cities, she'd been ready for a slower pace of life. But tonight reminded her that medical emergencies didn't respect geographic boundaries. Skills learned in busy trauma centers could be just as critical in small mountain towns when disasters struck. 10 minutes later, Briggs returned with a sterilized drilling kit and a radio. Doc Morrison's on the other end, he said, handing her the radio. She says she's never done this procedure herself, but she's got a medical textbook open. Juliet keyed the microphone. Doc, this is Juliet Carter. I'm going to need you to walk me through the landmarks for burr hole placement. Juliet? Came the surprised voice. I didn't know you had medical training. 8 years as a paramedic. I've assisted with this procedure before, but I need to make sure I'm remembering the anatomy correctly. For the next few minutes, Dr. Morrison guided her through the precise measurements and angles needed to relieve the pressure in Ben's skull without causing additional damage. It was a procedure she'd seen dozens of times, but had never performed herself. The landmarks were specific and unforgiving. 2 fingers above the ear, 1 finger back from the eye socket. The drill had to penetrate the skull without going too deep, had to avoid major blood vessels and brain structures. In a hospital operating room, with proper lighting and sterile conditions, it was a routine procedure. In a collapsed mine tunnel, working by flashlight, it was extraordinarily dangerous. Dr. Morrison's voice remained calm and professional as she walked Juliet through each step, but everyone listening could hear the underlying tension. They were attempting a complex medical procedure in conditions that would challenge even experienced neurosurgeons. Remember, Morrison said, the temporal bone is thinner than other parts of the skull, so you'll need less pressure. Listen for the change in sound when you break through. It'll go from a grinding noise to more of a popping sensation. The radio connection wasn't perfect this deep underground, creating occasional static that made communication challenging. But Morrison's instructions were clear and precise, based on decades of medical experience and careful study of anatomical references. But as she positioned the drill bit against Ben's skull, her hands were steady. All the doubt, all the fear, all the memories of Emma's small hand going limp, it all fell away. There was only the task at hand, the life that depended on her skill and experience. The drill made a high, whining sound in the confined space. Sarah whimpered and covered her ears. Briggs held Ben's head steady while Juliet worked with careful precision. The bone was thicker than she'd expected, but she could feel the drill bit making progress. She worked slowly, applying steady pressure, listening for the change in sound that would indicate she'd broken through to the space beneath. The smell of bone dust filled the cramped space, mixing with the sense of earth and dampness. Juliet tried to ignore the surreal nature of what she was doing. Performing emergency neurosurgery in a collapsed mine tunnel, working by flashlight, with a patient who might not survive the next few minutes, regardless of her efforts. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, she broke through. Immediately, dark blood began seeping from the hole, relieving the pressure that had been building inside Ben's skull. His breathing improved almost instantly. Beautiful work, came Dr. Morrison's voice over the radio. I can see his vitals stabilizing from here. Juliet sat back on her heels, suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline that had carried her through the procedure was beginning to fade, leaving her acutely aware of where she was and what she'd just done. 3 years ago, she'd sworn she'd never practice medicine again. She'd convinced herself that her instincts couldn't be trusted, that her training was more dangerous than helpful. But tonight, in this impossible situation, her skills had saved a life. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd left medicine because she couldn't save Emma, couldn't prevent the death of one small child despite doing everything correctly. Now she'd saved Ben's life by performing a procedure she'd never done before, in conditions that would have been considered impossible by most medical standards. We need to get them both topside now, but carefully, very carefully. The extraction took another hour. Briggs and his team had rigged an elaborate pulley system that allowed them to lift both patients from the collapsed tunnel without jarring them. Juliet rode up with Ben, monitoring his condition every step of the way. The ascent was nerve-wracking. The basket stretcher swayed and bumped against the tunnel walls, despite the careful handling by the rescue team. Juliet kept one hand on Ben's pulse and the other on his makeshift IV line, ready to respond if his condition changed. The rescue team had to work around the precarious position of the fallen beam, which limited their options for extraction routes. Every movement had to be calculated to avoid vibrations that might cause the beam to shift or trigger additional collapse. Tom Bradley coordinated the extraction with the experience of someone who'd seen too many mine accidents. His voice carried calm authority as he directed the positioning of ropes and pulleys, ensuring that every movement was deliberate and safe. "Easy now," Bradley called out as they maneuvered Ben's stretcher around a particularly tight turn in the tunnel. "Smooth and steady. This young man's been through enough." Sarah was brought up separately, her broken leg immobilized with a splint fashioned from pieces of wood found in the tunnel. She remained conscious throughout the extraction, though the pain medication had made her groggy and disoriented. When they finally emerged into the harsh glare of the floodlights, a crowd had gathered. Word had spread through Millbrook's emergency services network about the taxi driver who turned out to be a paramedic, who had performed emergency brain surgery in a collapsed mine tunnel with nothing but a flashlight and borrowed equipment. The story would grow in the telling, as stories do in small towns. By morning, half of Millbrook would believe that Juliet had single-handedly rescued all 12 victims. By evening, the tale would include dramatic details about unstable tunnel walls and narrow escapes from secondary collapses. But Juliet barely noticed the attention. She was focused entirely on transferring Ben to the waiting ambulance, rattling off his condition and treatment to the county paramedics, who would take him to the regional trauma center. Cranial depression fracture, intracranial bleeding controlled with emergency burr holes. ICP appears stable, but he'll need immediate neurosurgical consultation. IV established. Normal saline running wide open. Last vitals were... She continued the medical handoff, using language she hadn't spoken in 3 years. It felt both foreign and familiar, like returning to a childhood home after a long absence. The county paramedics, Mike Santos and Jennifer Liu, listened with professional respect. They'd been working emergency medical services in the region for 8 and 12 years, respectively, and they recognized competent medical care when they saw it. The procedures Juliet had performed would have been challenging in a hospital setting, let alone in a collapsed mine tunnel. Santos had seen his share of unusual rescue situations, but this was unprecedented in his experience. Emergency neurosurgery performed by a taxi driver in a collapsed mine was the kind of thing that would become legend in regional EMS circles. "Outstanding work," Santos said quietly as they loaded Ben into the ambulance. "We'll make sure the receiving hospital knows what you've accomplished here." The trauma team at Regional is expecting him, Lou added. Dr. Patterson is the attending neurosurgeon. He's excellent. If anyone can help this kid make a full recovery, it's him. As the ambulance pulled away with Ben secured inside, Juliet finally allowed herself to breathe. Sarah had already been loaded into a second ambulance, her broken leg stabilized and pain controlled. Both patients were going to survive. The realization hit her like a physical force. For 3 years, she'd carried the weight of Emma's death, convinced that her medical training was more curse than blessing. But tonight, that same training had saved 2 lives. Juliet. She turned to find Martha Chen approaching, her expression unreadable. "Why didn't you ever tell anyone?" Martha asked quietly. Juliet was quiet for a long moment, watching the ambulance's taillights disappear down the mountain road. "Because I was running away from it." "And now?" Juliet considered the question. She thought about Emma, about the weight she'd been carrying for 3 years. She thought about Ben's steady breathing as they lifted him from the tunnel, about Sarah's grateful smile as she was loaded into the ambulance. Now I'm not sure there's anywhere to run to. The rescue operation continued for 2 more hours. 3 more victims were extracted from other parts of the collapsed tunnel, all alive, all stable. The urban exploration group that had been trapped underground was finally complete. 12 people who had gone into the mine for adventure and come closer to death than any of them had ever imagined. The final 3 victims had been trapped in a side passage that connected to the main tunnel system. They'd heard the collapse, but hadn't been directly affected by it. However, debris had blocked their exit route, leaving them in darkness with no way to signal for help. Their rescue was less dramatic than Ben and Sarah's, but no less important. Tom Bradley, the retired coal miner, had navigated the twisted passage system to reach them, following air currents and the sound of voices to locate their position. They were frightened and dehydrated, but otherwise unharmed. The youngest of the 3 was Jessica Wong, a 19-year-old art student who joined the exploration group only 2 weeks earlier. She'd been documenting the mine with photography and sketches, fascinated by the interplay of artificial structures and natural decay. When Bradley reached them, Jessica was in the early stages of panic, hyperventilating and unable to focus on his instructions. Her companions, both more experienced explorers, had been trying to keep her calm, but the hours of darkness and uncertainty had taken their toll. Bradley's calm presence and obvious expertise helped stabilize the group. He'd been in similar situations before, had learned to project confidence even when outcomes were uncertain. His steady voice and practical approach to problem solving helped the trapped students focus on what needed to be done, rather than what might go wrong. "Easy now, young lady," Bradley had told Jessica when he first reached their location. "I know this is scary, but we're going to get you out of here safe and sound. My name's Tom, and I've been working in mines longer than you've been alive. Trust me when I say you're going to be okay." The extraction of the final 3 victims required different techniques from Ben and Sarah's rescue. The passage they were trapped in was too narrow for stretchers, so they had to be helped to crawl and climb through sections of the tunnel system to reach areas where rescue equipment could be used effectively. Bradley led the way, his miner's lamp cutting through the darkness ahead of them. Behind him, Jessica and her companions followed slowly, testing each handhold and footstep under his careful guidance. As dawn broke over Millbrook, the emergency vehicles began to disperse. The immediate crisis was over, and the town could begin to return to its normal rhythm. But Juliet found herself unable to leave. She sat in her taxi in the pre-dawn darkness, staring at the now quiet mine entrance. Her medical kit, borrowed from the fire department, sat beside her on the passenger seat, a reminder of the night's events. The mountain air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine trees and the faint smell of wood smoke from someone's fireplace. It was the kind of morning that usually brought Juliet peace, reminding her why she'd chosen to disappear into this quiet corner of the world. But tonight had changed something fundamental. For 3 years, she'd convinced herself that her old life was behind her, that she'd successfully transformed herself from a paramedic into a taxi driver. The weight of her medical training had felt like a burden, a constant reminder of her failure to save Emma. Now she wondered if she'd been wrong. The distinction between who she'd been and who she'd become suddenly seemed artificial. She was still the same person who'd completed 8 years of medical training, who'd responded to hundreds of emergencies, who'd developed the instincts and knowledge that had saved Ben's life tonight. Emma's death hadn't erased that knowledge or invalidated that experience. It had only convinced her to hide from it. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found Dr. Martinez's number, the cardiologist who'd explained Emma's condition to her 3 years ago. She'd kept his contact information, though she'd never been able to bring herself to call him. The phone rang twice before he answered. Dr. Martinez speaking. Doctor, this is Juliet Carter. I was the paramedic who brought in Emma Rodriguez 3 years ago. There was a pause. Juliet, I remember you. How are you doing? I think I'm ready to talk about what happened. Her radio crackled to life. Unit 23, you have a pickup request. Martha's voice sounded different now, tinged with something that might have been respect. Go ahead, Juliet replied. Mrs. Rodriguez needs a ride to the hospital. Her husband was one of the victims, stable condition, but she wants to be there when he wakes up.
Juliet started her engine. En route. She would finish this call with Dr. Martinez later. Right now, someone needed her help, and for the first time in 3 years, that felt like exactly where she belonged. Mrs. Rodriguez was Carlos Rodriguez's wife, Maria. Carlos was a mechanic who ran the town's only auto repair shop, a gentle man in his 50s who'd been part of the rescue effort until falling debris had struck him in the shoulder. His injury wasn't serious, but the impact had dislocated his shoulder and given him a concussion severe enough to warrant overnight observation. Carlos had volunteered for the rescue operation because he understood machinery and structural systems. His mechanical expertise had been valuable in rigging the pulley systems used to extract victims from the mine. But his eagerness to help had put him in harm's way when a section of loose rock had given way near the mine entrance. As she drove back toward town, the sun began to rise over the mountains surrounding Millbrook. The light was soft and golden, nothing like the harsh glare of the emergency floodlights that had illuminated the night's drama. Maria Rodriguez was waiting outside her small house on Elm Street, clutching an overnight bag and trying not to cry. She was a small woman in her 60s, someone Juliet had driven to the grocery store a few times, but didn't know well. Thank you for coming, Maria said as she settled into the back seat. I heard you were the one who helped save them down there. Juliet met her eyes in the rearview mirror. I just did what needed to be done. Carlos, my husband, he was so excited about helping with the rescue. Said he felt useful again, like when he was young and strong. She wiped her eyes with a tissue. I told him he was too old for such excitement, but he wouldn't listen. Now I'm glad he didn't listen to me. Being helpful is more important than being safe. They drove the rest of the way to Regional Medical Center in comfortable silence. Juliet found herself thinking about Maria's words. Being helpful is more important than being safe. For 3 years, Juliet had chosen safe. She'd chosen a life that couldn't hurt her because it couldn't touch her. But tonight had reminded her that some things were worth the risk. When they arrived at the hospital, Maria pressed a $20 bill into Juliet's hand, despite her protests. You brought my husband home to me, the older woman said firmly. That's worth more than any taxi fare. As Juliet watched Maria disappear through the hospital's automatic doors, she made a decision. She pulled out her cell phone and dialed a number she'd memorized but never called. Metro General Hospital, Human Resources. This is Juliet Carter. I used to work in emergency medical services. I'd like to inquire about reinstatement procedures. The conversation was brief but informative. Her certifications had lapsed, which was expected. She'd need to complete recertification courses, pass written and practical examinations, undergo psychological evaluation to ensure she was fit for duty. The process would take several months, assuming she met all the requirements. But the hospital still had her personnel file, and her employment record was excellent. Supervisor evaluations described her as skilled, dedicated, and calm under pressure. There were no disciplinary actions, no complaints from patients or colleagues. If she completed the reinstatement process successfully, there would likely be a position available. The human resources representative, a woman named Patricia Wells, had actually remembered Juliet's departure. "We were sorry to lose you," Wells said. "Your supervisors spoke very highly of your work. If you're ready to return to EMS, we'd welcome you back." The process, it turned out, would take months: recertification courses, competency evaluations, psychological assessments. The bureaucracy of redemption was complex and time-consuming. But as Juliet drove back toward Millbrook that morning, she found she didn't mind the wait. For the first time in 3 years, she had somewhere to go that wasn't just away from something else. Her radio crackled again. "Unit 23, pickup request at Miller's Farm. Elderly gentleman needs transport to his doctor's appointment." "Unit 23 responding," Juliet replied. She would continue driving taxi for now, serving the people of Millbrook who had become her neighbors and friends, but she would also begin the process of returning to the work she'd been born to do. Because sometimes running away isn't the answer. Sometimes the only way through the darkness is to turn around and walk back toward the light, even when, especially when, you're not sure you deserve it. The next few weeks brought subtle changes to Juliet's routine. She still drove her regular routes, still provided the same reliable service to Millbrook's residents. But word of her actions at the mine had spread through the town's informal communication networks, and people began looking at her differently. Mrs. Patterson, who called for a ride to the grocery store every Tuesday, mentioned that her grandson was studying to be a paramedic and asked if Juliet might be willing to talk to him about the profession. Mr. Henderson, whose wife needed regular transport to dialysis treatments, confided that he'd been having chest pains and wondered if Juliet thought they might be serious. Juliet found herself offering gentle advice, suggesting medical consultations when symptoms seemed concerning, providing reassurance when anxieties seemed overblown. She was careful never to diagnose or prescribe treatment, but she found that her years of experience allowed her to help people understand when their concerns warranted professional medical attention. The changes weren't just in how others saw her. Juliet began to notice shifts in her own perspective as well. The constant low-level anxiety that had plagued her for 3 years was beginning to ease. She slept better, woke with more energy, found herself looking forward to her days rather than simply enduring them. She also began to understand something important about grief and healing. Emma's death had been a profound loss, but it hadn't negated everything Juliet had learned and accomplished during her medical career. Her training, her experience, her instincts, these were still valuable, still capable of saving lives when circumstances demanded it. The guilt she'd carried about Emma's death began to transform into something different. Not the sharp, cutting pain of self-blame, but a deeper understanding of her own limits and humanity. She'd done everything correctly for Emma, just as she'd done everything correctly for Ben. The difference in outcomes didn't reflect her competence. It reflected the reality that medicine, like life, sometimes involved variables beyond anyone's control. 3 months later, Juliet received a letter in the mail. The return address was Sarah Mills, followed by a street address in a city 200 miles away. Inside was a photograph of Sarah standing on crutches beside a hospital bed. In the bed was Ben, awake and smiling, his head bandaged but his eyes bright and alert. On the back of the photograph, Sarah had written, "The doctors say Ben's going to make a full recovery. They also say he owes his life to the quick thinking of a taxi driver who turned out to be so much more. Thank you for not giving up on us. Thank you for not giving up on yourself." The letter that accompanied the photo provided more details. Ben had undergone emergency neurosurgery at the Regional Trauma Center, where doctors had been amazed by the precision of the burr holes Juliet had drilled. The procedure had prevented dangerous swelling that could have caused permanent brain damage or death. The neurosurgeon, Dr. Patterson, had specifically requested that his admiration be passed along to whoever had performed the emergency procedure. "I've never seen more precise burr hole placement," he'd told Sarah. "Whoever did this saved your boyfriend's life and preserved his neurological function. It was textbook perfect work under impossible conditions." Sarah's leg had healed completely, though she still walked with a slight limp when the weather changed. She'd completed her geology degree and was now working for an environmental consulting firm, using her experience in the Sterling mine as the basis for her thesis on abandoned industrial site safety. Most importantly, both she and Ben had become advocates for improved emergency medical services in rural areas. They'd testified before the state legislature about the need for better funding and training for small-town rescue operations, using their own experience as an example of how quickly routine situations could become life-threatening emergencies. "We've started a non-profit organization called Rural Rescue Advocates," Sarah wrote. "Our goal is to improve emergency response capabilities in underserved areas. We'd love to have you involved if you're interested. Ben says he owes you more than his life. He owes you his future. We want to make sure other people in remote areas have access to the same level of care you provided." Juliet propped the photograph on her kitchen table, where she could see it every morning when she had her coffee. Next to it, she placed her old paramedic badge, the one she'd kept hidden in a drawer for 3 years. The badge was tarnished now, its once bright surface dulled by years of neglect. But it was still hers, still a symbol of the knowledge and commitment that had never really disappeared, only hidden. She cleaned it carefully, polishing away the tarnish until it gleamed like new. 6 months after the mine rescue, Juliet Carter reported for her first shift as a certified paramedic with Millbrook Emergency Medical Services. The town had finally grown large enough to support its own ambulance service, and they needed experienced personnel to staff it. The idea for local EMS service had emerged directly from the mine incident. Town council members, faced with the reality of how long it had taken county paramedics to respond to the emergency, had approved funding for a basic life support ambulance and hired 2 full-time paramedics to provide coverage. Juliet had been the obvious first choice, both because of her experience and because of her demonstrated commitment to the community. The second position had gone to Marcus Chen, Martha's nephew, a recent EMT graduate who'd grown up in Millbrook and wanted to serve his hometown. The town had raised funds for the ambulance service through a combination of municipal bonds, state grants, and community fundraising. Local businesses had contributed equipment and supplies, while residents had volunteered to help with administrative tasks and community outreach. The new ambulance was state-of-the-art, equipped with advanced life support capabilities that would have been unimaginable in rural areas just a few years earlier. Cardiac monitors, defibrillators, advanced airway management equipment, and a comprehensive drug inventory that would allow Millbrook's paramedics to provide sophisticated care without waiting for transport to distant hospitals. But perhaps more importantly, the service had established telemedicine capabilities that connected Millbrook's paramedics directly with emergency physicians at the regional medical center. In complex cases, they could consult with specialists in real time, transmitting patient data and receiving treatment guidance that significantly improved outcomes. Their first call came at 2:17 p.m. on a Tuesday. Vehicle accident on the state highway, 2 cars, minor injuries. Routine response. As the ambulance raced toward the scene, Juliet felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. But this time, it didn't feel crushing. It felt like coming home. The accident was indeed minor, a fender bender between two pickup trucks, both drivers more embarrassed than injured. But as Juliet performed her assessment of the victims, checking vitals and looking for signs of trauma, she noticed something that made her smile.
One of the drivers was carrying a small stuffed elephant in his truck, the kind won at county fairs and seaside carnivals. When she asked about it, he grinned sheepishly. "It's my daughter's. She makes me carry it for good luck." Juliet carefully examined the man for signs of injury, but found herself thinking about another little girl, one who had carried a similar elephant 3 years ago. The memory still hurt, but it was a different kind of pain now. Not the sharp cutting edge of guilt and failure, but the dull ache of loss that could be carried and even transformed into something useful. Emma had died in her arms, and nothing would ever change that. But Ben was alive because Juliet had refused to let fear paralyze her. Sarah was walking again because someone had been willing to crawl into a collapsed mine tunnel. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that's all any of them could do. Keep showing up, keep trying, keep risking their hearts in service to others. As the ambulance headed back to base after clearing the accident scene, Juliet's radio crackled with their next call. Unit 7, respond to a domestic disturbance on Oak Street. Reports of an elderly man having chest pains. Marcus reached for the radio, but Juliet was already keying the microphone. Unit 7 responding. ETA 4 minutes. She hit the sirens and pressed the accelerator, feeling the familiar rush of purpose that came with racing towards someone who needed help. Behind them, the small town of Millbrook streamed past in a blur of familiar faces and safe streets. But ahead of them lay the unknown, another emergency, another chance to make a difference, another opportunity to prove that some things were worth the risk of caring. The elderly man on Oak Street turned out to be Harold Peterson, a 78-year-old retired teacher who'd been arguing with his son about moving to an assisted living facility. The stress of the argument had triggered what appeared to be a mild cardiac episode. Elevated blood pressure, irregular heartbeat, chest discomfort, but no signs of active heart attack. Juliet and Marcus worked together smoothly, establishing intravenous access, administering medication to regulate Harold's heart rhythm, and providing reassurance to both Harold and his worried son. Within 20 minutes, Harold's condition had stabilized, and they were able to transport him to the local clinic for further evaluation rather than making the long trip to the regional hospital. It was exactly the kind of call that highlighted the value of local EMS service. Quick response, appropriate treatment, and the ability to make decisions based on knowledge of local medical resources and patient preferences. As they cleaned and restocked the ambulance after the call, Marcus shook his head in amazement. "I can't believe how calm you stay," he said. "In EMT school, they taught us the procedures, but they never really explained how to handle the emotional side of it." Juliet considered his comment as she checked their drug supplies. "The emotional side is the hardest part," she agreed, "but it's also the most important. People call us on the worst days of their lives. Sometimes the medical treatment is secondary to just being present, being competent, being someone they can trust when everything else is falling apart." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "Is that why you came back? After, after you'd been away from it for so long?" Juliet had told Marcus about her previous career, but not about the specific reasons she'd left. She'd simply said that she'd needed a break and had spent some time doing other work. "I came back because I remembered why I became a paramedic in the first place," she said. "It wasn't about the adrenaline or the excitement. It was about being useful, about having skills that could make a difference when people needed help most." Their next call came 2 hours later, a construction accident at a job site outside town. A worker had fallen from scaffolding and was unconscious with possible head and spinal injuries. As they responded, Juliet found herself thinking about the progression of her career, from the overwhelming chaos of urban EMS to the focused, personal nature of small-town medical care. Both had their challenges and rewards, but there was something deeply satisfying about knowing the people she served, about being part of a community where her work had immediate, visible impact. The construction worker, a young man named Tommy Rodriguez, Maria's nephew, had suffered a concussion and fractured wrist, but no spinal damage. Juliet's careful assessment and stabilization allowed them to transport him to the regional hospital for imaging studies, but his prognosis was good. As they transferred Tommy to the emergency room staff, one of the nurses recognized Juliet. "I heard you were back in EMS," the nurse said. "Welcome back. We can use all the good people we can get." The comment stayed with Juliet as they drove back to Millbrook. For 3 years, she'd believed that her failure with Emma had disqualified her from medical work, had made her too dangerous to trust with other people's lives. But perhaps she'd been wrong. Perhaps the experience of loss, properly processed, had actually made her a better paramedic, more careful, more thoughtful, more aware of how precious and fragile life could be. 5 years after the mine rescue, Millbrook's EMS service had become a model for other rural communities. Their response times were excellent, their patient outcomes were exceptional, and their community integration was complete. Juliet had been promoted to EMS coordinator, overseeing a service that now included 4 full-time paramedics and a volunteer first responder program that had trained over 50 local residents. The service had also implemented innovative programs that other rural areas were beginning to adopt. Community paramedicine initiatives brought preventive care directly to elderly and homebound residents. Telemedicine capabilities allowed Millbrook's paramedics to consult with specialists at regional hospitals in real time during emergency calls. Most importantly, the service had established strong relationships with county and state emergency management agencies, ensuring that resources could be quickly mobilized for large-scale incidents like the mine rescue. But the real measure of success wasn't in statistics or recognition. It was in the lives saved, the families kept together, the community made stronger by the knowledge that help was always nearby. The Rural Rescue Advocates nonprofit that Sarah and Ben had founded had grown into a significant force for change in emergency medical services policy. They'd helped secure funding for 12 new rural ambulance services across the state, established scholarship programs for paramedic training in underserved areas, and created a network of small communities sharing resources and expertise. Juliet served on their board of directors, offering her perspective on the practical challenges of rural EMS operations. She'd also begun accepting invitations to speak at conferences and training seminars, sharing her experience with other emergency responders who might face similar situations. Her presentations were always focused on practical lessons rather than personal drama. She talked about the importance of maintaining skills even when not actively practicing, about the value of improvisation and adaptation in emergency situations, about the critical need for rural communities to invest in local medical capabilities. But inevitably, someone would ask about the emotional challenges of emergency medicine, about how to handle the cases that didn't end well, about finding the courage to continue after devastating failures. Those questions were harder to answer, but Juliet had learned to be honest about her own struggles. "I lost a patient 3 years before the mine rescue," she would say. "A little girl who died despite everything being done correctly. I convinced myself that my failure meant I was too dangerous to practice medicine, so I ran away and hid for 3 years." She would pause, looking out at audiences filled with young paramedics and EMTs who were just beginning to understand the weight of the responsibilities they'd accepted. But hiding from the possibility of failure also means hiding from the possibility of success. The skills I'd developed over 8 years of practice didn't disappear just because I'd experienced a bad outcome. And the people who needed help didn't stop needing it just because I was afraid. The most powerful part of her presentations wasn't the technical discussion of medical procedures, but the simple acknowledgement that even experienced providers sometimes doubted themselves, sometimes failed, sometimes needed time to heal and regroup. The courage to continue isn't about not being afraid, she would conclude. It's about being afraid and showing up anyway. Because the alternative is letting fear make the decision for you. 10 years after Emma's death, Juliet received an unexpected phone call. The voice on the other end was familiar, though she hadn't heard it in years. "Miss Carter? This is Dr. Martinez. I don't know if you remember me, but I was the cardiologist who treated Emma Rodriguez." Juliet's hand tightened on the phone. "I remember, doctor. I'm calling because I wanted you to know about something that's happened. We've established a new pediatric cardiac screening program at the hospital, and we're naming it in Emma's honor. The Emma Rodriguez Early Detection Initiative." Juliet was quiet for a long moment. That's wonderful. We've already identified 12 children with undiagnosed cardiac conditions. 12 children who might have faced the same fate as Emma if we hadn't caught their conditions early. I wanted you to know that Emma's death wasn't meaningless. It's led to changes that are saving other children's lives. The program had been funded through a combination of hospital foundation grants, state public health funds, and private donations. It provided free cardiac screening for children in underserved areas using portable equipment that could be transported to schools and community centers. The screening process was simple but effective. Electrocardiograms, echocardiograms, and family history assessments that could identify the vast majority of congenital heart defects that might otherwise go undetected until a crisis occurred. The program has already expanded to 6 other hospitals in the region, Dr. Martinez continued. We're hoping to make it statewide within 5 years. Emma's story has become part of our advocacy efforts, showing legislators and administrators why this kind of screening matters. After the call ended, Juliet sat in her office at the Millbrook EMS station, thinking about circles and connections, about how pain could be transformed into purpose when channeled in the right direction. She opened her desk drawer and pulled out a small frame she'd kept there for years. It contained a newspaper clipping about Emma's accident, with a photo of the little girl taken from a school yearbook. Bright eyes, missing front teeth, a gap-toothed grin that radiated pure joy. For the first time in 10 years, Juliet looked at the photo without flinching. Instead, she felt a quiet sense of peace, of completion. Emma's death had been a tragedy, but it had also been the beginning of something important. A screening program that would save other children. A reminder that even the worst losses could become part of something larger and more meaningful. She placed the frame on her desk, next to the photograph of Ben and Sarah, where both images could serve as reminders of why the work mattered. That evening, as her shift ended, Juliet walked out to the ambulance bay and looked up at the mountains surrounding Millbrook. The sun was setting behind the peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Her radio crackled one final time for the day. Unit 7, respond to a medical emergency on Pine Street. Elderly woman reporting chest pain. Juliet smiled and reached for the microphone. Unit 7 responding. En route. The call turned out to be Mrs. Patterson, the woman who'd been riding with Juliet to grocery stores for years. She was having anxiety-related chest pains brought on by worry about her grandson, who was now working as a paramedic in a distant city. I keep thinking about all the dangerous situations he faces, Mrs. Patterson confided, as Juliet checked her vitals. Car accidents, fires, violent people. How do you do it? How do you keep going out there knowing how badly things can go wrong?
Juliet finished her assessment. Mrs. Patterson's heart was fine, her blood pressure normal, her chest pain already beginning to subside with reassurance. "You do it because someone has to," Juliet replied. "Because when people are having the worst day of their lives, they need to know that someone is coming who knows what to do. Your grandson chose this work because he wants to help people. That's something to be proud of, not worried about." As they talked, Juliet realized that Mrs. Patterson's grandson was the same young man who'd approached her years ago, asking for advice about becoming a paramedic. She'd encouraged him to pursue his training, and now he was serving his own community, carrying forward the tradition of emergency medicine that connected them all. Some stories end with dramatic revelations, others end with quiet transformations that change lives one person at a time, one emergency call at a time, one act of courage at a time. Juliet's story was one of the quiet ones. But in the end, those might be the most important stories of all. The years that followed brought a steady rhythm to Juliet's life. Emergency calls punctuated by quiet moments, crises resolved, and families reunited. The constant cycle of responding to human need in all its forms. She'd learned to carry both Emma's memory and Ben's recovery as part of the same truth. That medicine was about showing up for people when they needed help most, knowing that outcomes weren't always within anyone's control. 15 years after the mine rescue, Juliet stood in the conference room of the new Millbrook Regional Emergency Services Training Center, watching the first class of paramedic students complete their practical examinations. The center had been built with funding from the Rural Rescue Advocates Foundation, designed specifically to train emergency medical personnel for small town and rural deployment. The students came from communities across 3 states, farm towns, mountain villages, isolated settlements where the nearest hospital might be hours away. They'd learned not just medical procedures, but the art of improvisation, the importance of community relationships, and the courage required to make life or death decisions with limited resources. "Congratulations," Juliet told the graduating class as they gathered for their final debriefing. "You're about to begin the most challenging and rewarding work you'll ever do. Remember that competence and compassion aren't opposing forces. They work together to create the kind of care that makes a difference." One of the students, a young woman named Rebecca Walsh, raised her hand. "Instructor Carter, you've talked about the importance of learning from failures. Can you tell us more about how to handle cases where we can't save someone?" The question hung in the air, familiar and still difficult after all these years. Juliet looked around the room at the eager faces, seeing herself as she'd been decades earlier, confident in her training, but unprepared for the emotional weight of the work ahead. "Failure is part of this job," she said simply. "Good people will die despite your best efforts. Children will be lost to conditions you can't control. And when that happens, you'll question everything. Your training, your judgment, your decision to become a paramedic in the first place." She paused, thinking of Emma, of the 3 years she'd spent running from medicine, of the night in the mine when she'd finally understood that healing herself meant returning to heal others. "But here's what I've learned. The worst thing you can do is let those losses stop you from helping the people you can save. Your skills don't disappear because you experience a bad outcome. The community doesn't stop needing you because you've been hurt. And sometimes the very experience of loss makes you more careful, more compassionate, more aware of how precious every life really is." Rebecca nodded solemnly. "How do you keep going? How do you trust yourself again?" "You start small," Juliet replied. "You take the next call, help the next person, save the next life. And gradually, you remember that this work isn't about being perfect. It's about being present, about showing up for people when they need help most."
After the graduation ceremony, Juliet walked to the memorial garden behind the training center. It was a quiet space where plaques honored emergency responders who died in the line of duty, including several from the original Sterling mine rescue who'd gone on to serve in other dangerous situations. At the center of the garden stood a simple granite bench with an inscription, "In memory of Emma Rodriguez and all the children whose lives remind us why this work matters." Below that, a second line had been added years later, "And in honor of the healers who find courage to continue." Juliet sat on the bench, watching the sun set behind the mountains. Her radio was quiet for once. The night shift had taken over, and Millbrook was peaceful under the early stars. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Sarah Mills, now Dr. Sarah Mills, who'd completed her graduate degree and become a professor of emergency management. The message included a photo of her own children, twin boys who were learning to explore the world safely, with proper equipment and careful supervision. "Teaching them about rocks and minerals today," the message read. "They wanted to know about caves, so I told them about the time a brave woman crawled into a dark tunnel to save their honorary Uncle Ben. They think you're a superhero." Juliet smiled, thinking about the strange connections that shaped all their lives. Emma's death had led to screening programs that saved other children. The mine rescue had created a network of advocates who improved emergency services across the region. Her own exile and return had resulted in new approaches to rural medical care. None of it had been planned. All of it had mattered. As the ambulance raced through the quiet streets of Millbrook one final time in her imagination, its sirens cutting through the peaceful evening like a promise. That help was coming, that someone cared, that even in the darkest moments, people like Juliet would be there to answer the call. Because that's what heroes do, not just once in a moment of crisis, but every day, in small acts of service and courage that add up to a life worth living, even when they're afraid, especially when they're afraid. The lights of Millbrook twinkled below as darkness settled over the valley. Somewhere in the distance, a radio crackled with the voice of the night dispatcher, sending help to someone who needed it. The cycle continued as it always had, as it always would. And in a small mountain town where everyone knew everyone's story, Juliet Carter, paramedic, teacher, and quiet hero, finally understood that the most important journeys weren't about reaching destinations, but about finding the courage to keep traveling toward the light. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. We'd love to hear what inspired you the most. And where in the world are you watching from? Let us know below.